20 minutes before Naomi Ellery was supposed to walk down the aisle, she went looking for her groom. She wasn't worried, not yet. 500 guests were already seated. The flowers alone had cost more than most people's cars. White roses stacked floor to ceiling along a marble hallway that smelled faintly of candle wax and money. Somewhere behind her, a string quartet was tuning, and her mother was fixing the same loose curl for the third time, muttering something about the humidity ruining an entire morning of work. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except Julian wasn't where he was supposed to be. She checked his suite first. Empty, except for his jacket thrown over a chair and a phone left charging on the nightstand, screen dark. She checked the terrace next, where he liked to take calls before big events, standing with one hand in his pocket like a man posing for a photograph no one had taken yet. Empty there too, the curtains moving slightly in a breeze that carried the faint smell of the gardens below. A bridesmaid passed her in the corridor, whispered something about the photographer needing 5 more minutes, and kept walking without waiting for an answer. Naomi barely registered the words. Something in her chest had already begun to tighten, quietly, long before she had a reason to name it. Then she found him in a hallway most of the guests didn't even know existed, tucked behind the east wing of the estate, the one reserved for staff. Narrow. Dim, the kind of hallway built to be walked through quickly, not lingered in. And he wasn't alone. His hand was on the side of a woman's face. Naomi recognized the uniform before she recognized the woman herself. Plain black dress, white collar, hair pulled back tight. The maid. The one who had poured champagne at their engagement party, without either of them looking twice at her. Julian's lips were on hers. Naomi didn't gasp. She didn't drop anything, didn't make a sound at all. She simply stood there, in 11 months of hand-stitched silk, and watched the man she was about to marry kiss another woman like it was something they had done before. Because it was. She could tell not from the kiss itself, from the ease of it, the lack of panic. The way his hand didn't flinch, didn't pull back in shock when it should have. There was no scramble, no guilty jolt backward. Just the quiet, practiced comfort of 2 people who already knew the shape of this moment. This wasn't the first time. Somewhere down that hallway, a clock was ticking toward the ceremony. Somewhere behind her, a room full of people were waiting to watch her become Mrs. Ashford. Somewhere beyond that, cameras were already being adjusted, lenses catching the light through stained glass windows built for exactly this kind of afternoon. And she hadn't said a single word yet. Hi viewers, quick question before we go further. If you found out 20 minutes before your wedding, would you still walk down that aisle, or would you turn around and walk out the front door? Type aisle or door in the comments. Naomi took a step back into the shadows before either of them noticed her. Not because she was afraid, because she wanted to hear what came next. Her mind moved fast, faster than she wanted it to, running through the last 3 years like footage she'd never bothered to slow down and actually watch. The late nights he called work, the trips that always seemed to end a day later than planned. The way he sometimes looked at his phone and smiled at something he never shared with her. She had built 100 small excuses for 100 small absences, and she had believed every single one of them, because the alternative had never once seemed like something that could happen to her. Women like her, she used to think, didn't end up standing in hallways like this. She was wrong about that too. And what came next was a name. A single name, spoken so quietly she almost missed it, a name that didn't belong to a stranger, and didn't belong to a secret Julian had kept from everyone. It belonged to someone standing on Naomi's side of the aisle that very afternoon. Someone she trusted completely. Someone she had already chosen to stand beside her when she said, "I do." She pressed her back against the wall, feeling the cold of the marble through the thin silk at her shoulder blades. Her heart no longer raced from nerves, it pounded from something colder. Something that felt a lot like betrayal wearing more than one face. Down the hallway, Julian's voice dropped lower, murmuring something Naomi couldn't quite catch. The maid answered him just as quietly, glancing once toward the door as if some part of her expected to be seen. Naomi didn't move, she barely breathed. Because in that hallway, in those few seconds, Naomi Ellery learned two things. The first was that her fiancé had been lying to her. The second, and this was the one that would keep her awake for weeks to come, was that he wasn't lying alone. To understand what happened in that hallway, you have to go back 3 years. Back to the night Naomi Ellery met Julian Ashford at a charity gala she almost didn't attend. He wasn't just wealthy, he was the kind of wealthy that rearranges a room the second he walks into it. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Waiters straightened their posture without being told to. And somehow, out of everyone in that ballroom, he chose to sit next to her, close enough that she could smell cedar and something faintly expensive she couldn't name. She thought it was fate. It wasn't. Julian didn't do anything by accident, not the seating. Not the flowers he sent the next morning, an absurd number of them, enough to fill her small apartment with color for a week. Not the proposal 18 months later, staged perfectly for the photo that would run in 3 different magazines, timed to catch the exact angle of the sunset behind them. Naomi had grown up around money, but her family's fortune was quieter than his, older, thinner than it looked from the outside. Her father, Richard Ellery, still wore the same watch he'd worn for 20 years, still drove his own car when no one was watching, still counted every renovation on the family estate against a budget, only he seemed to track. Julian's world moved faster, louder, every gesture generous and calculated in equal measure, as if kindness and strategy had long ago become the same instinct in him. She told herself that's just how people like him love. There had been a season early on, when Naomi genuinely believed Julian was the exception. He remembered small things, the name of her childhood dog, the anniversary of a grandmother she'd only mentioned once, the exact way she liked her coffee on cold mornings. He built a version of romance so specific, so tailored to her, that it never occurred to her to ask how a man that busy found the time to notice all of it. The answer, she would later understand, was that noticing was never the hard part for Julian. Noticing was a skill he had built an empire on. It was only ever a question of what he chose to do with what he noticed. The first warning sign came 6 months in. It was small, almost nothing. A dinner where Julian snapped at a waiter for bringing the wrong wine, his voice sharp and sudden, gone as quickly as it appeared. He turned to Naomi a second later and smiled like nothing had happened at all, reaching for her hand across the table. She told herself everyone has a bad night. The second sign came a year later. Naomi walked into his office and found him mid-conversation on the phone, his voice low, almost gentle, in a tone she'd never once heard him use with her. Not the voice he used at galas, not the voice he used with investors. Something softer, private. He hung up fast when he saw her in the doorway. Said it was work. She believed him because believing him was easier than the alternative. The third sign didn't even feel like a sign at the time. It was Celeste at Naomi's engagement dinner, going quiet the moment a member of the household staff walked past their table. Just a flicker. A pause in the conversation that lasted half a second too long, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. Naomi noticed these things the way you notice a draft in an old house. Nothing you can point to. Nothing you can prove. Just a coldness that shouldn't be there, slipping in through some crack she couldn't find. She never once put them together. Why would she? Each one on its own meant nothing. It was only standing in that hallway, 20 minutes before her wedding, that every one of those small moments came rushing back at once. No longer separate, no longer forgettable, but pieces of something she should have seen assembling itself for 3 years. She had missed it because she hadn't been looking for a pattern. She'd only been looking for reasons to keep believing him. There was a fourth sign, too, one she hadn't let herself count until now. It happened only 2 months ago, at a dinner with Julian's business partners, when someone mentioned in passing a household staff member who'd been with him since before the expansion. Julian had laughed it off smoothly, changed the subject to the merger, and Naomi had let it slide past her without a second thought. 2 months. That was how close she'd come to hearing the truth from a stranger at a dinner table instead of a maid's uniform in a hallway. Naomi didn't confront them. Not yet. She needed to know exactly how far this went, and there was only one place to start. The staff list. Priya Devane, 14 months of service. Naomi remembered glancing at that name once, months ago, running her eyes over it the way you skim a page you don't expect to matter, and feeling nothing at all. Now every letter of it felt like a warning she'd ignored. 14 months was only the beginning. Buried in Julian's home office, in a drawer she had no real reason to be opening, was a folder of maintenance receipts for an apartment across the city. Paid monthly, quietly. From an account with no name Naomi recognized, rooted through a shell company whose only purpose seemed to be keeping this exact kind of question from ever being asked. That was the first discovery. The second came faster. A phone left charging on the desk, not Julian's, but one of the staff devices left behind during the party setup. A single message thread, still open on the screen, short. Careful, the kind of messages people send when they already know someone might be watching. Not tonight, too many people around. She'll be gone in 20 minutes, I promise. Naomi read it twice before her hands stopped shaking enough to set the phone back down exactly where she'd found it. Angled the same way, screen dimmed the same way, as if the room itself needed to believe nothing had been touched. The third discovery was the one that finally broke something loose in her chest. A photograph, tucked behind a drawer that didn't sit flush the way the others did. Julian, younger, standing beside Priya outside a building Naomi didn't recognize, not this year, not last year. Years ago, judging by the haircut, the jacket, the way the photo's edges had already started to curl with age. This wasn't 14 months. This was longer than her entire relationship with him. She turned the photograph over, some instinct telling her there might be something written on the back. There was. A date, faded but legible, and beneath it, in handwriting she didn't recognize, 3 words that meant nothing to her yet and everything to her later. Before the money. She didn't know what it meant, not yet. But she understood, holding that small square of paper in a hand that wouldn't quite stop trembling, that whatever this was, it went back further than a wedding, further than an engagement, further than the life she thought she'd been building for. 3 years. She sat down slowly on the edge of the desk, still in her wedding dress, the silk pooling around her like something already discarded, and felt the last piece of the life she thought she was about to start quietly fall away. How long had everyone known, except her? She thought about walking straight into the ceremony and asking Julian herself, right there in front of the officiant, before a single vow had been spoken. She thought about it for almost a full minute, the idea sitting heavy and tempting in her chest. But some part of her, quieter and more careful than her anger, knew she wasn't ready yet. Not until she understood exactly who else in her life had been standing quietly on the wrong side of this secret. There was only one person left to ask. She found Celeste in the bridal suite, fixing her lipstick in the mirror like nothing in the world was wrong, humming something under her breath, completely unaware of the version of Naomi now standing in the doorway. "You're late," Celeste said, not turning around. "Everyone's asking where you." "How long have you known about Priya?" The lipstick stopped moving. Naomi thought back now, piece by piece, to every moment she'd almost caught this, the hesitation at the engagement dinner. The subject changed a little too quickly, more than once, whenever Priya's name came up in passing conversation. A canceled lunch the 1 week Naomi had mentioned wanting to meet the new household staff in person. Celeste suddenly and conveniently unavailable that entire week. Small things. All of them small until they weren't. Almost a year, Celeste finally admitted, setting the lipstick down with a hand that wasn't quite steady. I found out by accident. I didn't know how to tell you without destroying everything you'd built. There were a dozen moments you could have told me. I know. You chose all of them, Celeste, every single time you chose him. Celeste's face cracked for just a second, the mask of 15 years of friendship slipping just enough for Naomi to see something underneath it. Not cruelty, but cowardice, which somehow felt worse. Cowardice you could forgive in theory. Cowardice that had cost her a year of her life in practice. I was trying to protect you. You were trying to protect the wedding. That's not fair. None of this is fair, Naomi said, and for the first time her voice wavered just barely before she steadied it again. There's something else, Celeste said quietly, staring at the floor now instead of the mirror. Something I don't think you've found yet. Naomi went very still. Say it. The photograph in his office, the one behind the drawer. Celeste's voice dropped almost to nothing. It's not what you think it is. It's not just history between him and her. Then what is it? Celeste opened her mouth, then closed it again, glancing toward the door as if the answer belonged to someone else to give. I don't know the whole story, she admitted. I only know it goes back to your father. Naomi felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the way it had in the hallway 20 minutes earlier, the way the whole morning had started tilting the moment she went looking for a groom who wasn't where he was supposed to be. Down the hall, a knock. The officiant needed an answer. 500 people were seated, waiting for a bride who no longer knew who in her own life could be trusted, checking their watches, whispering behind folded programs, the first ripple of confusion already moving quietly through the room. Naomi looked at her reflection in the mirror Celeste had just been standing in front of. Perfect dress, perfect hair. A face that didn't look like it belonged to a woman about to blow up her own wedding. She had less than 10 minutes to decide. Walk down that aisle and pretend the last hour never happened. Or walk into that ballroom and let everyone in her life see exactly who had been standing beside her all along. She thought, strangely, of her father in that moment, of the way he always said that the truth costs nothing to tell and everything to hide. She had never fully understood what he meant until she was standing in a wedding dress with 10 minutes left to decide who she wanted to be. The doors opened exactly on time. 500 faces turned. The quartet lifted their bows, drawing the first slow notes of a song Naomi had chosen months ago, back when she still believed every word of the vows she'd written. She walked down the aisle in front of everyone who mattered to her and stopped, halfway there in front of all of them. The music faltered, then fell silent, the musicians unsure whether to continue. There's something everyone in this room deserves to hear. Julian's smile fell first. She told them about the hallway, the 14 months on paper, and the years underneath that paperwork never showed. She told them about the message on the phone, the photograph behind the drawer the apartment paid for in silence. She didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. The room did the raising for her, a low current of gasps and whispers moving row by row like a wave finding the edges of a pool. Julian reached for her hand, lowered his voice, told her this wasn't the place. You're right, Naomi said. It's not. But you made that choice the moment you decided 500 witnesses were worth the risk. That was the moment the side doors opened. Richard Ellery stepped into the ballroom, still in his coat, having arrived from the airport only minutes before. Expecting nothing more than to walk his daughter down the aisle, he was now watching her stand frozen in the middle of. His suitcase was still in the car. He hadn't even had time to loosen his tie. He didn't ask what was happening. He already knew. His eyes moved past his daughter, past Julian, and landed on the woman in staff black standing near the back wall, half hidden behind a pillar as if she'd been hoping not to be seen at all. He went still. Priya, he said quietly, and something in his voice made the entire room lean in without moving an inch. Naomi turned, confused. "Dad, you know her." Richard didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every ounce of its usual composure. "Her mother worked for this family 20 years ago," he said. "I let her go the year everything with our finances went wrong. I never forgot her name. I never forgot what we owed her." The room shifted, phones lowering slightly, the true shape of the night rearranging itself in front of everyone, guests exchanging glances that said none of them had expected the story to reach backward this far. Julian's confidence, so effortless only minutes ago, began to crack under the weight of a history he clearly hadn't accounted for. He looked between Richard and Priya, calculating something, the way he calculated everything. And for the first time in 3 years, Naomi watched him fail to find the angle fast enough. "Someone want to explain what's actually happening here," Julian said, his voice reaching for its usual authority and falling short of it. Richard didn't look at him. He was still looking at Priya, the way you look at a debt you've spent 20 years hoping never to have to pay. "You worked in my house too," he said to her, "before all of this, before Julian ever knew your name." Priya's voice, when it finally came, was quieter than anyone expected, but steady in a way that carried across the entire silent ballroom. "You knew exactly who I was the day I started working for him," she said. "You just never said anything, because saying something would have meant admitting what you owed. Because what Julian never knew, what almost no one in that room knew, was that Richard Ellery had structured his daughter's protection long before tonight, built quietly around a debt to a family he'd wronged decades earlier, one he never intended. Julian to profit from. Naomi wasn't walking away from this marriage with nothing. She was walking away with the one thing Julian Ashford could never rebuild in time to save himself. Guests would talk about this wedding for years, not because of the dress or the flowers or the quartet that never finished its second song. They would talk about the 60 seconds a father and a daughter, standing feet apart, both learned the same truth for the very first time. Naomi didn't cry until the doors closed behind her. Outside, the afternoon was still bright, the kind of ordinary daylight that felt almost insulting after what had just happened inside. Cars lined the driveway, drivers leaning against them, unaware that the wedding they were waiting to drive a happy couple away from had just ended before it began. Naomi stood on the top step for a long moment, still in her dress, watching the doors behind her stay shut. No one came after her. Not right away. And somehow, that silence told her everything she needed to know about how the next few weeks were going to go. The story didn't end in that ballroom. It ended 3 weeks later, in a lawyer's office, over a single piece of paper that had been sitting untouched in a filing cabinet for 20 years, yellowed at the edges, waiting for a moment none of them could have predicted. Richard Ellery's debt to Priya's family wasn't sentiment, it was structure. Decades earlier, when his own company nearly collapsed under the weight of a bad investment, he had quietly signed away a percentage of future family holdings to the woman he'd let go without severance, without warning, without a second thought at the time. It had felt back then like a formality, a way to ease a guilty conscience without costing him anything real. He never expected to have to honor it. He never expected her daughter would walk back into his life, wearing a maid's uniform in his future son-in-law's house. But debts like that don't disappear, they wait. When the paperwork surfaced, it didn't just protect Naomi. It tied directly into the very holding company Julian had used to secure his merger, the one his lawyers had built the entire wedding contract around, confident that every asset on that side of the family was clean, unclaimed, uncomplicated. Julian had spent months assuming Richard's family was the smaller name in the room, the quieter fortune, the one that mattered less. He was wrong. One of his own board members, a man who had known Julian for nearly a decade, was quoted later saying he'd never once seen a deal unravel that fast over something that had nothing to do with the numbers on paper. It wasn't the affair itself that spooked them, he admitted. It was the silence afterward. The way Julian had no answer ready, no statement prepared, no version of events that made him look like anything other than a man caught completely off guard by his own life. Within days, two of his largest investors quietly withdrew. Not because of the video circulating from the ceremony, though that certainly didn't help, spreading faster than anyone in his office could contain it. They withdrew because a legal claim now sat over assets they'd assumed were clean, and men who move that much money rarely wait around to find out how deep a crack actually goes. Julian Ashford didn't lose everything overnight. He lost it the way empires actually fall. Slowly, then all at once, in boardrooms no one filmed, in phone calls that grew shorter each week, in a calendar that quietly emptied itself of the meetings that used to fill it. Priya's part in it all was never as simple as the ballroom made it look. She hadn't chased Julian's money. She hadn't even known, at first, who Richard Ellery's daughter was. She had taken the position in that house because it was the only steady work available to her that year, and Julian had found her there, familiar, quiet, easy to keep secret, long before Naomi ever entered the picture. That didn't make it right. It only made it real. There was a version of this story where Priya was simply the villain, the other woman, the one who smiled sweetly while quietly dismantling someone else's life. It would have been easier for everyone if that version were true. It wasn't. She had grown up hearing her mother's name mentioned in the Ellery house with a kind of bitterness. She never fully understood until she was old enough to read the paperwork herself. By then, Julian had already found her, already built something around her that felt, for a while, like the first stability she'd ever known. None of that erased what happened in that hallway. It only meant the story had more than one person quietly paying for choices that were never entirely theirs to make. Naomi never spoke to her again after that night. Some doors close simply because they have to. Celeste tried more than once to explain herself, showing up outside Naomi's apartment twice in the first month, calling far more than Naomi ever answered. Naomi let her speak, eventually, sitting across from her at a coffee shop neither of them used to frequent, careful to choose neutral ground for a conversation that had nowhere safe left to happen. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Celeste had said. "Good," Naomi answered, "because I don't think I can, not yet, maybe not ever completely." It wasn't cruelty. It was honesty, the same kind Naomi had learned to value more than comfort somewhere in that ballroom. She never fully forgave her, and she never fully cut her off either. Some friendships don't end in a single moment. They just quietly change shape and stay that way, smaller than before, careful in a way they never used to need to be. As for Naomi, she didn't disappear from the world the way people sometimes expect a humiliated bride to. She stepped back into it, slower than before, steadier than before, choosing more carefully this time who got to stand close enough to matter. She kept the dress in a garment bag in the back of her closet for exactly 1 year, then gave it away without ceremony, without a story attached to it, to someone who never needed to know what it once meant. What she kept instead was the 60 seconds she stood in that ballroom and told the truth in front of everyone who was supposed to matter. That moment cost her a wedding. It gave her back everything else. A year later, at a small dinner with people she actually trusted, someone asked her if she regretted stopping halfway down that aisle instead of waiting until after the ceremony to sort it all out quietly, the way so many people in her circle might have. Naomi thought about it for a long moment before answering. "If I'd waited," she said, "I would have spent the rest of my life wondering what I gave up the courage to say in exchange for looking fine in the photographs." No one at the table had anything to add to that. They didn't need to. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. The people who try hardest to hide the truth are usually the ones who end up losing the most when it finally comes out. And the people brave enough to speak it, even standing alone in a room full of witnesses, are the ones who walk away whole.